Hi, I'm Josh Bassages, Director and CEO of the Royal Ontario Museum. Welcome to this special online presentation of our signature lecture series, ROM Speaks. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation since time immemorial to today. From fascinating viewpoints to thought-provoking insights, ROM Speaks presents the brightest minds and most compelling voices on ideas that matter across art, culture, and nature. Please enjoy this essential new addition to our ROM at Home digital programming. And I look forward to welcoming you back to the museum for more programs like this when it is safe to do so.
Hello, everyone. I'm Terry Watada, Thanks, Bryce, for introducing me. He said he would. But that's okay. We go way back. I want to thank everyone for braving this cold night and coming out. There's an awful lot of you, that's for sure. That's great. I'm very grateful. And thanks for listening to me. I'd like to start by saying that only art can capture the beauty and tragedy. And I think Ron Korb, who was not also introduced by Bryce, but his music is a perfect example of this. It's melodious, sometimes spirited, certainly melancholy at times, but very beautiful. The pieces in the exhibit are beautiful as well. But for me, there's a missing component, and that is, and you may disagree with me about this, but it's the joy of community that's missing. It's our greatest loss. It goes over generations, and it's the destruction of the sense of community. In my novel, The Three Pleasures, I explore that destruction and the resistance to it. It's filled with stories I had gathered for seemingly decades from Issei, the first generation of Japanese Canadians, and Nisei, their children. The excerpt I'm going to read is based on one told to me by Toyo Takada. Some of you may remember him. He was one of our first historians. And the excerpt itself is about Hastings Park, which was the holding and distribution center for Japanese Canadians outside Vancouver. Hastings Park was the horse barn of the PNE, the Pacific National Exhibition. It's similar to the Horse Palace at the CNE today. And so imagine, if you will, having to live in horse stalls, waiting for word about where you will be going next. Amid the squalor and disease, the Japanese Canadians in there decided to put on a variety show of all things, like the community shows put on by the churches and the organizations. And so this is about that variety show. The stage, a wide raised platform with no curtains, sat glumly against the back wall of the basketball court in Building L of Hastings Park, where the children went to school. The workmen had given it a fresh coat of paint, but the house lights overhead diminished any sparkle it might have produced. To compensate, Ayako Tsuji, a gifted Nisei artist, created a large blue and black mural of the Steveston's fishing docks as a backdrop. Men with nets in shadows laboring around nameless boats. The irony was not lost on anyone. An upright piano brought in from a church stood erect at one end of the stage. With hands at the ready, Vernon Hakaku sat poised behind it in a tuxedo, a strange image given the circumstances. But it was Vernon all the way, with his romantic and lofty ambition to play a grand piano at Carnegie Hall one day. After all this craziness, the audience, made up of a good mix of locals and evacuees from the lower mainland and coastal Japanese communities, rumbled into the hall until the place buzzed. It was impossible, but it seemed everyone in the pool and Powell Street was there. I told my parents, but Dad was uninterested, grumbling about a waste of time. He stood glaring at me with dismissive eyes. Mom worried about the rumored rats and maggots. I tried to assuage her fears, but then there was a small outbreak of dysentery. That did it. She would stay home. Onto the stage stepped the regal Hisae Furuya, her face radiant with ruby-red lipstick, rouged cheeks, and long, full eyelashes. Her floor-length chiffon gown swept across the stage as she made for the center stage microphone. Her broad smile brought applause from her eager admirers. When Vernon arpeggioed into a minor key, the smile migrated to her eyes. She gave forth with full-bodied voice and the crowd settled into its rapture. From the side steps of the stage, Irene and I watched. Irene beamed in the performance and the size of the audience. It was wonderful. We were all together, and I held the moment for as long as I could. Sam Furia, in his white evening jacket, black tuxedo pants, and patent leather shoes, bounded up the steps and, as everyone saw, gave Irene a hug. She swooned, and the crowd laughed before going wild as she stepped onto the stage. With his Hollywood sneer and thick black hair, Sam Furia turned heads wherever he went. His muscular V-shaped build made the girls shriek if he paid any attention. Everyone knew his voice was like velvet, wrapping around a song like a humid breeze on a hot summer's day. Audience members swore his eyes and teeth sparkled when caught in the light. When the suave crooner stepped toward the microphone, everyone in the place fell silent in anticipation. He nodded to Vernon, who trilled the piano keys as an introduction to Someone to Watch Over Me. Sam's honey-coated baritone then rose and fell with the emotion of the music, the climb and slide of the melody massaging his listeners until he finally descended towards the ending coda. Many girls sighed and raptured. With his trademark grin, he bowed and the audience rose to a standing ovation. And the next instant, the stage was empty. After I gently nudged her out of her spell, Irene seized the opportunity to enter the stage to make introductions for the next act. A troupe of baton twirlers from Britannia High School, but was pushed aside by a sudden and ominous presence. I swung around to see an agitated Inspector Gill and 2 constables rushing to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gill began, "there will be a slight delay in the show. Just sit tight." Confusion reigned as several more RCMP constables appeared and fanned throughout the room. Inspector Gill then jumped to the floor in front and called forward someone in a 3-piece suit and pinched shoes. Hisamu Otagaki, a Nisei man with narrow shoulders and weak jaw, came forward and walked toward the audience, inspecting each face with a keen eye. Every so often, he pointed to certain individuals, whereupon constables pounced on them and took them to a holding area outside the main doors. Otagaki was an Inu, a dog, a traitor, selling out his own for favors and future considerations for 30 pieces of silver. Jimmy sprang to his feet and rushed the man. "You Katsunowana!" he shouted in Japanese. He was still the young buck I knew him to be, but there was now a fierce fire in his soul. It was clear he had a cause to live for, and he was deeply angry. 2 Mounties immediately grabbed him, but Otagaki stopped them from dragging him away to jail. "He's not one of them," he casually declared, "but get him out of here." This was Inspector Gill's plan to flush out Japanese nationals still hiding in Hastings Park. Someone later told me that he heard Gill saying, "A friend of mine once said that there's only one man who can tell one Jap from another, and that's another Jap." And Otagaki was that man. Otagaki had always been an outsider. He was by generation a Nisei, but the same age as the Issei. Who wouldn't accept him because he didn't observe any of the Japanese traditions and tried to be Canadian instead. More importantly, couldn't speak any Japanese. With tears welling up in her eyes, Irene's mouth fell open wordlessly. She reached forward in a useless gesture to try to stop the travesty, but soon squeezed her hands into fists. I tried to comfort her with an arm around her shoulders, but she pushed it away. She'd been duped. She was a patsy, a fool, a real ultra-maroon. She shook uncontrollably, seething with the betrayal. In a moment of clarity, she rushed to Gill's side and grabbed his arm. "What do you think you're doing?" Gill turned with a yank on his elbow and glared. "Stand back, Miss Kondo. This is a case of national security. My job, no duty, is to use whomever and whatever means necessary to protect Canadians and Canada." Irene shrank from the harshness of his voice and the coldness of his eyes. This was Gill's plan all along. It was the time of dogs and villains. Thank you. Mr. Ron Korb.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am indeed Ron Korb, even though Bryce didn't know that. You'll see Terry and I, we're actually not just sharing the podium, we're actually sharing the same seat. Well, I must have... This next piece I'm going to play is called Floating Bridge of Heaven. And normally I describe that piece, it's from the album Japanese Mysteries. Normally I describe it as the Shinto creation myth. But this past 2 weeks, I was going through my mother's old photo albums. And I just saw, this beautiful storyline. Of course, I knew that, but I just thought I could put it together in a video, and it would work with this piece perfectly. These pictures you're about to see are all taken in 1939. So they're all 80 years old this year. And when my mother was just 18, 19 years old, she got the opportunity to go to Japan. She was born in Prince Rupert, grew up in a very tiny place called Buckley Bay, which doesn't even exist anymore, in the Queen Charlotte Islands. And then the family moved to Vancouver. And her sister moved to Japan, her sister Kay. And so she invited my mother to come, and she took a steamer across the Pacific Ocean. And those 2 years were the happiest years of her life. I mean, she would always refer to that, and looking at the pictures, I could really see why. What you might find interesting, because I don't want to bore you with my family history, but there's a gentleman in these slides as well. His name was Jiro. And he was an admirer of my mother. They never held hands, they never kissed, but nevertheless, he proposed marriage to her several times. And even when she went back to Canada, he would continue to write letters to her. And of course, my mother ended up going into the internment camps in New Denver, and that was no longer possible. But after the war, Jiro, with his excellent English and his architectural background, and he came from a poor family, but he became one of the richest men in Japan, and he created a huge real estate empire. And my mother never got to see him again. We had planned, though. He always sent a Christmas card. I had spoke to him on the phone a number of times. He actually had an office in New York. And we made this arrangement to meet him, and he died just 1 month before our trip. So we never actually got to see him. But anyway, this is just, for me, anyway, it's just a lovely memory. So the piece is called Floating Bridge of Heaven. I have two microphones for talking. This next piece is called Autumn Rain, or in Japanese, Murashigure. And last summer, my wife and I had the privilege of traveling to BC. I was playing a concert there. And then we actually spent some time in the Slocan Valley going to various internment locations. It was actually very interesting to do that. We went to Caslow and Sandon and New Denver and Greenwood. And my mother was in the New Denver camp, and they have a very beautiful museum there. So many of the pictures you're going to see are actually from that museum. And I recommend it to anybody to go and see. So the name of the piece is Autumn Rain. Now for a different change of pace. And as Terry would point out about joy of community, how many of you have the winter blues? Yeah, I mean, this last week has been particularly bad. And I actually really appreciate everyone coming tonight because it was a real sacrifice to bear the weather that we had. This next piece is called Island Life. Has a little bit of a Caribbean or Hawaiian sort of feeling. It does have a Japanese connection. This flute, or this ocarina, is a Japanese ocarina made in Nagano by the same kind of ocarina that Sojiro plays. And someone told me it was made by Sojiro, but I don't believe that. But anyway, it's the same kind of ocarina. And the images you're going to see are from our recent trip to Japan last year. And a lot of it you might think are from a Caribbean or some place like that, but it actually is Japan. Island Life. This next piece is from my new album, World Cafe. And by the way, Bryce was also supposed to mention that my albums are available and Terry's books are available here afterwards. Now we just have to humiliate ourselves by being... This piece features the bass flute, this instrument here, which plays an octave lower than the silver flute. And the piece, Sans Regret, of course, no regrets. The video you're going to see is when my mother returned from Japan. Again, they immediately were put into what Terry was talking about, Hastings Park. They were immediately taken away and then taken to several different places and eventually New Denver. And something I actually didn't know myself, I didn't realize that in New Denver, when they first arrived, there were only tents. They didn't even have any proper housing. And so anyway, the images that you're going to see again are all from my mother's own photo album, and also my cousin, Mike Ashikawa, who's not here today. And there are a few of my relatives in the audience, and you're probably going to see yourself up on the screen as children. Yeah. So this is called Sans Regret. I guess I should have mentioned my mother was a teacher in the school, one of the schools, the Pine Crescent School. You could see the images up there. And is Mike Murakami here? Is Aiko here? Because Aiko was the principal at Orchard Park, is it? Orchard School, yeah. Anyway, you can talk to her later. This next piece is called Sisters of the Wind, and it's actually an animation done by Patrick Jenkins, who's also here tonight. I wrote a little poem because that kind of expresses a little bit about what I think this piece means to me. I was born of this land, and now the ground is cold and frozen. I miss the ocean, the warmth of my house, and the taste of food from our kitchen. I miss my old friends, and I miss my old happiness. I hear the birds hiding in the trees and see them flying above me. I wonder if they cherish their freedom. In my dreams, I fly with them. Okay.
I'm back. Oh, by the way, Bryce, no, we love you. I say that because I don't want him to get back at me the next time he doesn't introduce me. When I was born, it was the 1950s. Yeah, I know, I'm old. But it was 18 years after my brother was born. Yeah, I know that too, yeah. Word got out, apparently, amongst the Nisei and Issei. Mrs. Watada is pregnant? Really? A Nisei, at my mother's funeral in 1984, approached me and revealed that to me, that it was a huge surprise everywhere in Toronto. I said, it must have been a real surprise for my mother, too. I mean, can you imagine? No, Mrs. Watada, it's not a tumor. But anyway, growing up in the 50s and 60s, as I said before, there was no real community per se, although it came up every so often in the festivals and special anniversaries and birthdays. And so when the Issei danced, my poem, as a tribute to the Issei, the first generation of Japanese Canadians in Canada, is about those moments. And Ron and I are going to try something here. We're going to do a little jam here of some kind. We'll see if it's successful. Anytime.
You can blame it on Bryce.
Yeah. When the Issei danced, it was a time of celebration, a thing of joy. At Hideki and Kei's wedding, Takahashi-san tied his necktie around his head and improvised hachimaki with fan in hand, jumped to his feet, and cavorted to an ancient minyo. He contorted his face in every which way, lips one way, the eyes the other. He kicked his crooked leg up to the restaurant dining room ceiling while twirling the fan with his fingers in geometric patterns. His hands in choreographed position. The children giggled, everyone else laughed, especially Okasa. Father smiled. At Grandpa's 88th birthday, Beiju, while Rikimatsu, Tohana, and Kawai-san raised glasses of Johnny Walker Red, going all out for this one, before the banquet of Chinese cuisine on wobbly tables, Fujiwara-san smacked his hands together, announcing a celebration, an odori, a dance, danced, and everyone clapped in time. As he sang a cappella, his voice soaring to the ancestral spirits, and they sang back. Tsuki ga deta deta, tsuki ga deta, ayoi oi. The ethereal notes wept in the air conditioning as Grandpa stood to join in, and Fujiwara-san danced like a young man. Punctuated by grunts and calls to join in, they floated on the notes of an old fushi, the melody of community. A 50th wedding anniversary in the basement of China House when Dad kissed Mom for the first time to my recollection. And cheers rode like disturbed dust, and the white jacket waiters served the abalone in rich brown sauce, the taste of BC Coast, their home 3 decades ago. The expense of the past is no longer affordable. And they held hands while a gang of Issei circled around them. They smiled in happiness. Their 2 sons shed the blood of memory. When the Issei danced to the rhythms of old Japan, they pantomimed the lyrics, and memories cried, a sight to behold, of love unfolding. Chanto, chanto, chanto. Walking down the boulevard with the hairdo of a married woman, I am a wisteria hanging above, and you're a lily below. It is amusing, but all disappears when I awake to the lonely clarity of an empty morning. Thank you.
So again, to take away the winter blue, I'm going to end with a piece called Cordoba, which is, of course, about Cordoba in Spain. It doesn't really have much to do with this, but you can clap along, you can dance. And actually, to be honest, there was a connection in Japan, at least with Spanish music, because when I lived in Japan, there's Japanese Canadians, but there's also lots of Japanese South Americans who had a very kind of a similar history. And many of them during the 90s moved back to Japan because things were so dire, things weren't really going that great in countries like Peru, etc. So I would go in places like Hamamatsu, I would go down to the local, like just the downtown, I'd see them playing guitar and singing and playing Spanish music. So in a way, it kind of reminds me of that as well. Thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience. And like you, like me, we're all really looking forward to seeing the exhibit.